Welcome to The Line. An article by Andrew Oxford in the Santa Fe New Mexican over the Labor Day weekend pointed out that the workforce here in New Mexico is among the least unionized in the country. Only about 8.3% of workers in the state were represented by a labor union in 2017, and that put the state 33rd in the nation. But even though the numbers are small, the article says the unions plan to play a big role in the coming election and legislative session. To talk about this and other issues, I'm joined at the table this week by former State Senator Diane Snyder's with us. Daniel Foley, former New Mexico House Minority Whip, is here. Former State Senator Eric Griego right across from him. And attorney Sophie Martin is back. Now, Eric, starting with you. A lot of ways we can go with this conversation about unions. I want to start on a big, broad scale here. And unions and their value to a workforce in the overall. Give me your 1 minute wrap on that. Set us up here. Why are they important to you? And then we'll get into the details of it.
Well, what we know about the growth and decline of unions, right, is early in the first part of this century, when we had about the level of unionization that we have now in the 10 to 15% rate,
right,
is when we had the greatest inequality. As unions grew in power, the distance between the top 10% and everybody else really narrowed, and right about the mid 50s is when really they were sort of on par. As unions have declined in the recent decades, inequality has increased. So what unions have fundamentally done is taken this growth in productivity, which we've had over generations now, and really make sure that a good share of it went to working people, not just to the wealthiest 10%. So as we've seen unions decline, we've seen inequality increase, we've seen a smaller and smaller share of productivity, that is what workers produce, go to actual workers.
Right.
And so I think it's a fundamental problem in our country, which I think we have to address. And whether or not you think unions are a good idea, the data is pretty clear. As unions have declined, inequality has increased, and I think that's the biggest story, right? That's the biggest story of.
Dan, do you have a counter to that? Does that make sense to you in your philosophy about how work should be done here? Wages going up if unions membership increases. Can you get with that? And is there any reason why New Mexico shouldn't be more unionized as a state?
Well, those are some loaded questions. I mean, I think clearly as we're giving people more and more options to be members of unions, more and more people are choosing not to be members of the union. I think unions clearly, I think Eric makes a valid point. I think, at the turn of the century, when people could say, look, you're going to work 7 days a week, I'm going to pay you for 5. You're going to work 18 hours a day, I'm going to pay you for 9. You don't get overtime. Since that time, and a lot of it, I think, is a credit to unions. My family was a very union family in New York for years. I think that drove a lot of legislative changes. There's so many laws on the books now that prevent those things from happening, whether it's OSHA, whether it's the labor, Fair Labor Board, whether it's, the Labor Department. I think that what you're seeing now, and I think the reason why unions are not only declining in New Mexico but across the country, is I think unions have really become a political organization.
Let's get into that, and I want to touch on Sophie. I want to come back to that point here. We have a difference here with public sector union members versus other occupations, and there is a difference that we want to get into. There's been some movement in the news last couple of years about public sector union folks. Get your sense of this and that end of it, the public sector folks.
So two things, I think two major things have happened in terms of public sector unions, and these are the unions that work with people who work for government. So the first is that we've seen a decrease in the number of public employees as Republicans here in New Mexico and across, now in federal government have sought to decrease the number of federal employees, number of state employees have gone down. Sort of by definition, if we have fewer people working for government, we're going to have fewer union members there. But the second is a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision, Janus v. State, County, and Municipal Employees, in which the Supreme Court majority essentially said, yeah, unions are okay, we're not going to ditch public sector unions entirely, but unions can no longer count on everyone within the pool that they represent contributing financially to the support of the union. And so that loss of revenue, which is I think the immediate impact that we expect to see there, will impact the union's ability to function, to negotiate on behalf of its employees. We're also seeing some movement to expand that decision. There's a case that was recently filed in another state, not New Mexico, in which Attorneys are arguing that they shouldn't have to join the Bar Association, claiming that that's a type of union. I think we're going to see
Really?
people trying to be creative in their attacks against unions. I will say that Justice Elena Kagan, in her dissenting opinion in Janus, points out that the history of unions. In the history of unions, there was a benefit both to employees who didn't have to do individual negotiations on their salaries and their working conditions. There's also a benefit for the employer. And we tend to think of that sort of like small business one-on-one employer, but if you have thousands of employees, it can be awfully helpful to have one team, the union team, to negotiate with, so that you're not doing individual salary and condition negotiations with each person. And so unions, I think, in addition to everything that Eric has said, perform a really important function that helps to keep business going and helps to keep employees healthy.
Good point. I like that. It's interesting. I want to come back to some of that public sector stuff too. Diane, your overall thoughts on this, but then also for New Mexico. The case Sophie mentioned was particularly apt here for public sector
It is
folks, isn't
particularly apt, but it just happened.
Right.
There was an immediate impact so far as dues not being withdrawn out of state paychecks. But the statistics we've been looking at is that unions have been declining for some time. So I see this having a greater impact in the future than it has right now on the data that we're looking at. A couple things that have happened, I think, and particularly this relates to New Mexico, we don't have as much manufacturing here. And that's heavily unionized throughout the country. But we've had technology increase since when unions first started. So you're not needing as many employees in the manufacturing sector as you did in the early days. I mean, particularly in textiles and things like that. You just don't need that anymore. It's done by a machine. So I think that's a bigger factor. I think for New Mexico, so much of our focus and so many of our things, particularly when you look at Los Alamos and Sandia and all the high tech, there aren't a lot of unions in those industries.
Right.
So it's not going to have as big an impact in that section as it will in public schools and, to me, state employees.
Right.
I just wanted to follow up on something that Dan said. So one of the things we know about wages, New Mexico has some of the lowest wages, if not the lowest wages, for not just the country, but all our surrounding neighbors. We always talk about economic development and how Colorado, when we're competing with, all of our surrounding states have higher wages than we do, average wages than we do. We also have some of the lowest unionization rates, and we're sort of in a club of very poor states with a couple of exceptions, mostly southern states. And there's a direct relationship between not having a viable, active, powerful union membership and having some of the lowest wages in the country and some of the worst outcomes for him in poverty, because ultimately, whether it's in politics, in the political arena, or just in the workplace, unions have been the main voice to really make sure that working people, working families, have a strong voice in terms of who gets paid, not just benefits and labor laws. And by the way, the unionization rates didn't decline because people thought that unions were useless. There's been an active legal campaign, not just Janus is the most recent, but over the last generation, starting with Reagan and the whole air traffic control strike, the PATCO strike, basically siding against unions. It's hard. It isn't easier to join a union. In fact, it's harder to join a union. Some of the biggest organizing now is in services, so it's not even in the public sector. We've had a really hard time in a low-wage state like New Mexico organizing service employees. We have a SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, which is one of the biggest growing unions, has a tiny local here. And they're trying to organize, and they've had a really hard time organizing service sector employees who are the lowest wage workers and who need a union the most in an economy like ours.
I belonged to two unions in my past, and for low-wage employees, it was very difficult to get folks to sign on because it's easy to scare people off. We got about a minute and a half. I got to throw this on the table. Eric, I'll start with you on this. Did we if you support unions, miss a window on a new era of things, particularly rideshare, Lyft, Uber, that kind of thing? There's a feeling out there now that the window for that was there at the very beginning. There should have been an organization push, but now that it hasn't happened, it's impossible now. Do you have an opinion on that? 'Cause I hear a lot of
Well,
different
I think
things,
it's
so-
controversial because this
Yeah.
whole sort of share economies it's hard for working people. I mean, ultimately, all of the research has been done on individual behaviors. Like people are going to do what they need to do to afford. So whether you may not want to shop at Walmart because of terrible labor practices, but people on fixed incomes do it. You may not want to use Uber or Lyft
Right.
or Airbnbs, whatever, but people are doing it because they can save money. So the real opportunity, I think it's an opportunity for unions to start thinking about ways to organize some of these folks, whether or not they're officially unions or they're cooperatives, and there are ways to really democratize the economics around work.
That's right. Did you have a point on that?
Yeah.
Okay. If you could do it real quick.
Just quickly, the unions in New Mexico are extremely powerful for as small as they are. Legislatively and in elections, they give more money than anybody else. So and I don't mean to be tacky, but why have they not been more successful in some of their legislative actions at getting the economy better? Why have they not thought in terms of, I'd like to have seen the unions playing a more active role in making the economy better. Therefore, they would have more members because members would say, they're the reason. So,
Anybody want to pick up on that? That's an interesting point. I mean, it's one of those things where
There's nothing I can add that's going to take 5 seconds. There's a lot to say. But
We'll pick it up again at another point. We'll have to wrap that there. When we come back to the line, we'll look at why some children with disabilities have to wait years for needed services. But up next, I sit down with Albuquerque Mayor Tim Keller to talk about his priorities in year one and why his administration is calling for people to come together to help the city.